Okay, now it's officially 10, so I should begin. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending this. So first of all, I want to thank Morgan, Sarah, and Hugo for organizing these fine 2 days of the Cambridge Talks. Really amazing work. So thank you for that, and to everybody that participated in the organization. So I'm going to present the ideas that I'm trying to put together in my prospectus, which I'm writing now these weeks and these days, on the afterlives of urban corporatism, civil and religious associations in modern Lima, 1880s to 1940s. This is a title that I put together yesterday, so if you have better ideas of the title, I will be very grateful. So first, one first image to locate Latin America and Peru. I don't want to assume that everybody knows the location well, so that is Peru in the map of Latin America, and in the right, Lima, the only large city in the country, a city of 11 million people, whose urban history is what I will be focusing on my project. Now, the dissertation project that I describe in my prospectus is about land property, or more broadly, land tenure in Latin American cities, and specifically in Lima, Peru. I want to investigate examples of the modern history of the city in which land was held collectively. Collective property has for long been practiced, studied, and legally recognized in rural areas. Indigenous, native, and or peasant communities and their communal land have been legally recognized in Latin America since the early 20th century. So that's already something that has already happened. But the space of the city has remained identified with the realm of individual tenure or individual property. And the cartoon in this picture of Edilberto Jimenez is only one depiction of this widely shared conception. This is, however, a modern dichotomy, the one between rural collectivism and urban individualism. In the colonial period in Latin America, which is roughly from the 16th century to the early 19th century, collectivism was the norm also in the cities. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of colonial society was corporatism. And this is, of course, something that applies to early modern Spain and other parts in continental Europe. Colonial Latin America was a corporatist society in the sense that the individual was not at the center. Groups were the center. So I'm here referring to guilds, religious orders, Indian towns, universities, merchant societies, soldiers, confraternities, etc., etc. Many examples of these groups. So these groups were the main unit of organization of a more decentralized society than what we are used to in the modern period. And let us see an example here. So here in the picture, you see a depiction of a Catholic festivity in 17th century Cusco, Peru, the Corpus Christi, where groups with diverse or ethnic origin are standing in the parade in a certain position or are linked to a certain saint or virgin that are in the upper part. Non-religious people, so those who were not priests, nuns, monks, were often also members of a confraternity or brotherhood created around the devotion to a religious figure, such as the ones that are paraded here. So, for example, you have a saint here and a group of people that are part of the confraternity that takes care of not only of the festivity, but also of more things than just the festivity. These confraternities of lay people administered high levels of power and autonomy beyond their religious duties. They were one of the main ways to be a member of the society, what in modern terms we will call urban citizenship. And these arrangements were open to indigenous people and even to free or enslaved Afro-descendant men and women. And as I was mentioning, the one that I pointed out is San Cristobal, and the people that take care of San Cristobal is a group of indigenous people in urban Cusco in that case, but that also happens throughout Latin America. So my point here is that groups were at the center of urban life in the colonial period. And this translated also into land tenure. Urban land in Lima, the city whose archives I'm studying, had a strong presence of collective forms of land tenure in its maps, mainly confraternities. As I mentioned, confraternities were associations of lay people that gather around the advocation of a saint or virgin but had also an important role in social and economic matters, such as the administration of urban land for the benefit of their members. Some properties in the city were held by confraternities. For example, in this map in the left, the one that I found was in black, painted in black up there. Some in other forms of divided property, emphiteusis and census. I think those words are in Spanish, but I think in English it's the same words. Emphiteusis and censuses are the ones that are in light blue and in pink. And some properties directly belong to the church, and in this case it's the one marked with a cross up right. And so this is some things that I picked in a very initial exploration in the archive that I had in the last summer. So in this context, property was handled by corporate institutions which had, among other characteristics, a leadership, a bylaw, a set criteria for membership, and very importantly, a minimal circulation of the land, or we could say a minimal level of commodification of the land. And this was, of course, this type of stabilized property, the kind of land tenure that modern reforms try to get rid of. So modern reforms, and I didn't know what picture to put for modern reforms or modern law, so I just put a car, one of the first cars that arrived to Lima. The liberal reforms promoted in Peru and in Hispanic America in the first half of the 19th century, after the struggle for independence, tried, among other things, to advance a paradigm of individual citizenship. The economic development of this individual citizen required the adoption of private property as a key legal instrument. Private property. So private property was included in the most fundamental laws of the Republican era, the constitutions and the civil codes. And that's also the case in common law systems like the US and UK. It's not constitutions and civil codes. Well, in the case of the US, it's constitutions, but also in the common law, it's also property, quite an important instrument. So, and with more or less changes, this is the legal framework of property that is still in force until today. Things have changed, of course, in some details, but structurally, that's the legal history that you still study in law schools, and that's legal history that I also taught in law school back in Peru too. However, as you might be suspecting, this liberal version of the law is more a myth, or as some people put it, a work of science fiction than a tangible reality, this liberal version of the law, this individualized version of the law. In fact, some of the forms of collective tenure of land that were characteristic of the colonial history of Peru appear to have persisted after the liberal reforms of the 19th century, and that's what I want to show you. So part of the archival evidence of what I am saying is these cadastral maps that I showed you before. These are actually a cadaster, a privately run cadaster of the city of Lima in the year 1900. So I put it as an example of colonial things, but this is actually a map of the year 1900. But for some reason, it was in the colonial section of the National Archive of Peru. So the forms of land tenure of the map were supposed to have disappeared by then. So emphiteusis, census, cofradías, confraternities, church property in general are supposed to have disappeared, and yet, as you see in this one and some other images that I took, these late medieval and early modern arrangements appear here in the archives long after the end of the colonial period, and that's very recent. In 1900, that's the same century in which all of us or most of us were born. So this is actually incredible. These things are appearing there. It's like finding a dinosaur when you go to the archives and find this. And this is something that I encountered when I worked as a lawyer as well. So these are things of very, very old legal history, and you see them there while practicing law, and this is something that makes no sense, and yet they are there. So this is part of the archival exploration that I will conduct more systematically starting this coming summer. But how to understand this continuity? This is a question that I'm making. So I posit that this persistence of colonial institutions is just one more example of that big label that is often attached to the process of Latin American urbanization, which is informality or illegality. And that includes scholarship on urban studies, on history, and also on law. So we have a myth of a certain type of law and a set of practices that look quite different on the ground. Property law is individualistic, cities grow collectively. Thus, the historiographical intervention that I propose is to use the methods of social history to look at these informal spaces, not from the eyes of the myth of the law, but from an observation of everyday legal practices. Some call this social history of law. And let me give you some examples to bring these ideas to earth, and that's the last part of this presentation. One is the case of the confraternities, cofradías in Spanish, of Afro-descendant people, and I'm taking an example for the purpose of today of the confraternity of aguadores, the water carriers, the Afro-descendant water carriers that existed in Lima until the 19th century, that were devoted to the religious figure of the Our Lady of Copacabana in the district of Rimac. So these were groups that I will be studying mainly in the district of Rimac in Lima. They have existed since colonial times and remained active, according to some chronicles and travel diaries that I found, at least until the late 19th century, or perhaps even later. Different reforms, legal reforms, had been passed to eliminate these forms of collective tenure of land, and yet they still existed well into the Republican period. They were a form of social network that allowed Afro-Peruvians a participation in the urban society of the time in 19th century Lima. And as I mentioned earlier, while they were originally an association organized around a religious figure, and also a form of guild as well of the water carriers, the confraternities were also an instrument of social mobility. Through donations, last wills, and the administration of their goods, they had interests apparently in many more pieces of land than what was expected for the time. And this is something that I'm finding in the character maps that I showed you earlier. A second example, in the first decades of the 20th century, Asian migrants arrived in Lima as well. Japanese migrants were among the largest groups not only in Peru, but in the whole region. Peru is only second to Brazil in terms of the number of Japanese migrants in Peru. And after periods of working in haciendas or plantations in the coast, many migrated to the city of Lima and occupied similar spaces to other subaltern groups. Japanese migrants also navigated their presence in the new city, playing with and against the terms of inclusion of the liberal and modernizing laws. They founded guilds and mutual aid societies, and when a couple of the more important mutual aid societies merged in 1917, they created the Central Japanese Society of Peru, whose first directive board was portrayed in this picture. As a mode to access resources that were not otherwise available to them, they used practices like the tanomoshi or pandero, a mutual aid arrangement that served as a culturally and religiously influenced alternative mode of financing that, by the way, was not in the civil code or in any law at the time, but was actually successfully used by them to finance some small businesses. So their presence was substantial, especially in small businesses in the center of the city. I have yet to determine whether there are some neighborhoods and spaces that have archival traces of their land management practices. That's part of the work that I also want to do, and this is something that I will be exploring in the first decades of the 20th century. And finally, the third example, the most famous among urban historians of Peru, and also among architects as well, and the one that initially motivated this project, the migration to Lima by people from the Andean region, which marked the explosive growth of Lima since the 1940s. Among other manifestations of this famous informal set of practices, like using possession instead of property, the disregard of urban plans, and the practice of progressive construction or self-construction, the main vehicle for community organization of these spaces, of these informal spaces, were the housing associations or housing cooperatives. These were associations of families that joined in a collective venture that began with taking up the land and continued with the negotiation of services provided by the state and the claims for recognition of their neighborhood as part of the city. And same as in the previous cases, the collective was the main political actor in this struggle to become part of the city. And once again, land was not used as a commodity. To access to a piece of land, you didn't buy it. Land was controlled. The access to a piece of land was controlled through a process of becoming a member of the association. So it's interesting because you don't buy land as a commodity, you have to become member of an association to become an owner or a part of or a neighbor of the city, which is maybe the detail that I'm trying to see in all these examples. Thus, the overall research question in all of these cases that I have shown to you will be the following. Were there, in the urban history of Lima, collective forms of land tenure that were practiced by subaltern groups to claim belonging in the city or to claim urban citizenship? How were these practices and on what kind of law they were based? That's what I'm asking in the whole project. And so I have spoken in this presentation about the corporatist background in the colonial period. My interest in this research comes from the present, as perhaps is the case for any historian. You want to take the historical subjects in their own terms, but your research question is determined by your present time. So why does this matter? And this is the last slide. Well, collective property has entered the conversation in today's urban policy and housing policy, both in Peru and everywhere in the world, I will say. It exists, collective property, it exists today in Peruvian law. I personally participated in the development of the reform that introduced this as a radical alternative to the current model of a marketized production of land and housing, the one that has created a housing crisis in Peru, a housing crisis that exists, of course, in the region and of course, here in the US as well. Now, what I had in mind when proposing this while working in the government was the model of the community land trust, a US form of collective property that has started being explored in some large cities in Latin America. But my research asks if there was in Peru a local history of collective non-commodified land tenure arrangements, and that's what I'm exploring. Perhaps the confraternities, perhaps mutual aid societies, perhaps the housing associations and cooperatives. This is what I will be exploring in the archives during the next year or during the next years. And that is all that I wanted to present to you. Thank you.
We have time for plenty of questions.
As a PhD student, perhaps mainly a remark. As you say, it's a very common feature in a lot of pre-industrial societies. In Morocco, you had also this kind of thing. In France, to a lesser extent, etc., etc. So I think some comparative, even if it's superficial take, would be really useful. And then I have really just a suggestion, which is do not forget the spatial form it takes.
Okay.
Because, does it entail, specific urban form, specific way to divide the land, etc.? I think would be a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it integrated into the plot structure, etc., etc.?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the properties of the church, and with another thing, which is in a lot of situations, you have actually also a superimposition of, properties. You may have people who have different rights on the same piece of land. So that's also a question you might want to ask yourself. Can you imagine multi-property or multi-instances, which would, for example, also preserve, because the risk is always with this kind of thing. For example, in France, the Catholic Church is year after year abandoning large swath of urban land to real estate promoters. So, and that's always the risk when you have this kind of collective property, or institutional property, that by the end it ends in the hand of developers. So, that was just, but it's a fascinating subject, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I'm curious if you can speak a bit more about the use of these lands, because you spoke about question of access and how they are less of a commodity, but the way they access them has changed as more of a collective work. And you mentioned housing and a form of access to urban citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if they were used in different ways. Just speaking of my own very little experience of studying the history of like land that was communally owned for farming had different laws in the Middle East than what those that were for housing purposes. And I was wondering if the land types you're looking at had any other purposes except for housing or
Yes. Yeah, that's very interesting. So yes, and it varies in these three examples that I showed. In the last one, in the housing cooperatives and housing associations, yes, it is for housing. It's the invasion or taking up of lands, and then they organize to have a piece of land where people will build their own housing, and they will have still some kind of community arrangement for maybe working the streets or doing some of the communal activities that involve like even social events and things like that. So in that case, there is an individual space that you have in the neighborhood, but also somehow a membership in the association that makes you part of that neighborhood, but it's tied to housing. But that is interesting because that's different to the other ones. In the case of the confraternities, for example, the cofradías, so people don't live in the land of the confraternities. That's maybe a source of funding for people that are just maybe starting some kind of urban participation in the city, of people that were just recently manumitted, or people that have just migrated to the city. So these confraternities actually manage the land, leasing it to different people that might be even people outside the confraternity, and that money that is entering is used for different purposes: the religious purposes, but also the events, the festivities, or the mutual aid that they give to the members. But in that case, what I'm most interested is that not necessarily for people living in the land that they are owning, but the fact that a very important actor in the management of land there, it's a collective entity that decides collectively in assemblies with a board. So in that, it's actually different, but still that's my interest in that. And in the case of the Japanese migrants and the mutual aid societies in general, for example, they are using this more for commercial spaces in the city. So that might be also a little different. So yeah, there is a variability in the way these things are used, and that's something that we'll see how they change because probably also I'm also interested in the commodification of land and how that is problematic in relation to housing. Perhaps in relation to commercial purposes, it's not necessarily that problematic. So yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah.
I'm a little bit curious about the history of the law itself. So I wonder if you've looked into how, when the law comes from Spain originally, how it applies to the Peruvian context, and if the way that the topography or whatever other features of the land, how they might influence how this law was applied. So just a sort of like a deeper history of the law itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in legal history, it's actually so the Spanish were in Peru 300 years. So it's longer than what the Republic of Peru is now. That is only 200 years and something. Still, that's something actually quite problematic in discussing with people working post-colonial studies or decolonial studies, because the colonial periodification in Latin America, it's very different than the decolonization in other parts of the world. So it actually it makes it a little weird. So the liberal reforms happened during the Republican period in the case of Latin America. That's not something that happens perhaps in India or in African countries. But coming back to your question, so the legal history, how I think we study it, and I was mentioning this because we study the legal history not that much as a clear imposition, but something that has gradually changed over time, and having ties, or at least arguments that resort to not only the colonial period, not only to Spanish law, but even to Roman law, to medieval Roman law, and to ancient Roman law. So it's a little difficult to to say Spanish law when this is something that was practiced and used over hundreds of years in Peru. So maybe to take a chunk of what you're saying, the imposition that I'm interested is the liberal imposition of the liberal law, the private property paradigm of the 19th century. That's in France, the civil code, the Napoleonic civil code. In Germany, it's also the German civil code after unification. In Peru, it's also the civil code of Peru. It was adopted in 1850s, in the 1850s. And again, that was adopted in the Republican period. So rather than a Spanish concept, it's actually maybe a European-based idea of law that is more rationalized, that is more individualized. So not that much a Spanish agenda that had already been cut those ties with Spain. So yeah, maybe the question about imposition of Spanish law will be more a question in the early colonial period, actually. That is not the period that I'm studying. Yeah, I don't know if that's useful.
Thanks so much for presenting. This is going to be a fantastic project. I have a question about the kind of legacy of the corporation in the kind of urban context. So obviously you mentioned how it's a kind of translation from early modern Spain and from Europe. I'm wondering if there is, kind of similar to the previous question, if there is an adaptation in the Latin American and Peruvian context, specifically given the kind of multi-regional nature of society, which you pointed out very clearly in the image. I'm also thinking of kind of corporations as playing a larger role kind of globally in colonial history at this point as kind of a vessel of imperialism, a vehicle for imperialism. I'm just curious how you might relate the history of corporation here in the urban context to this broader kind of traveling of the concept of the corporation.
So you mean whether it's somehow connected to colonization or empire projects, this element of corporatism? Yeah, so for example, something that and this is also very recent in my studies, what you find in colonial Latin American history is how people are trending towards problematizing or making more complex the study of the colonial period instead of very clear colonial administration that is subjugating the colonial subjects. It's actually, and that's quite interesting in this scholarship, it's a very decentralized system in colonial society in Latin America. So you, for example, as what I was mentioning, you're a member of a confraternity, but perhaps you're also going to the university, and you're perhaps part of the army. So for many different things in your life, you resort to these different groups to solve your own issues with someone else. For topics in relation to your tenure of your land, it might be the confraternity. For other things, it will be maybe the audiencia or the court in the colonial in colonial Peru. And for only some things, you will go directly to appeal to the king or to the representative of the king. So in that sense, what this scholarship is well, for a while already writing a lot, is having a colonial society a little more demystified and finding that it's actually very decentralized. And that's quite interesting, like thinking in modern terms to read about, because in the modern period, there is more an idea of a very clear top-down administration where there is the government and the citizens. That's a more unified scheme that we have today. And recently, we are starting to talk about legal pluralism or diversity or pluralism, most in which there are different groups in society that are coexisting with the government. For example, Native Americans here in the US, and they have their own laws. They are coexisting. That's legal pluralism. Interestingly, people to start thinking how arrangements of legal pluralism can function here in this period of time, people are starting to look at the colonial period, in which this decentralized mode of governance was the rule and not the exception. So that's something that is going on now in scholarship, in historical scholarship. Very interesting to me. Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you. We are going to move on to the next presenter. Thank you so much.